Throughout my childhood, I lived and grew up in Indiana. And to be a little more precise, my house was in a rural part of Indiana. And for those who aren't so well versed with my state, when I say rural, I mean the middle of absolutely nowhere in Indiana. The closest grocery store from my house was a minimum 20-minute long drive, but that too without traffic and during good weather. Speaking of me, I used to love exploring a lot, and I would just go driving around on new roads, simply to look around and explore whatever there was to see. While doing this, I have come upon a little more than my fair share of something's not quite right kind of roads. I have a couple of stories to share, which I can remember off the top of my mind. I believe you'd love one story the most, because that one incident has fascinated every single person I have told it to. But before that story, let me tell you a different story that I might forget later. So let's begin with it right away. It has happened a couple of times in my life that I have been followed by strangers. As usual, I used to be out driving my car in an area that I'd never been to before. And I used to love to explore places that were impressively extra rural. As in places that had no houses, no telephone poles, and nothing whatsoever for miles at a stretch. So I was in a place where the road takes an unusually shaped turn through some incredibly thick trees, and halfway through that curve, I am suddenly met with a decline down into a beautiful creek flowing down a valley. If you've ever heard or come across the term, the hollers of Kentucky, but never had a mental image of what a hollow is, that was it. That view was a picture-perfect example. There was nothing but thickly wooded inclines back up to standard elevation for the region to my right, and on my left is a still young cornfield and a creek within a short distance. Beyond that was the other side of this little valley, sloping back upwards towards normalcy and also heavily wooded. This place was beautiful to see, and I was very much enjoying myself. For a moment it just gave me a vibe that I was in Narnia. The hollow wasn't terribly wide, but I've got to tell you that it was longer than you'd expect. Very unexpectedly, I come around a curve in the hollow as it followed the creek, and I am suddenly in view of an upcoming property on my right, nestled into the wooded incline. I pass one single rundown house with a couple of barns in an advanced state of decay, a heavily overgrown yard, and a small collection of very ratty cars in various states of disassembly. All of them were quite heavily rusted. It was daylight, so I couldn't tell if lights were switched on in the house, but it was the kind of place that you see and just immediately, unquestioningly presumed to be long abandoned. It just had an abandoned look attached to it. Then suddenly, the entire valley felt uncomfortable and unwelcoming. The feeling just slapped me out of nowhere. I simply can't explain it or elaborate on it, but I just knew for sure that someone was, or some people were on that property, and they watched me when I passed it. Less than 5 to 10 minutes later, this bright orange jacked-up Chevy pickup was in my rear view, and it was gaining on me. I applied some pressure to the gas and made a turn back towards the nearest small town. He turned in the same direction as mine and was still gaining on me. The road wasn't exactly supportive of my car, whereas his pickup seemed adaptive to the terrain. This small town seemed more like a ghost town. The entire purpose of getting there was so that I could find help if required. But there was literally no one around here at all. So I picked up as much pace as I could and made another turn towards the closest real town, the one with the grocery stores and restaurants. As I kept driving, I kept checking the rear view, and this guy was still coming in my direction and was in fact getting closer and closer. Now I could even read his number plate. I turned, then turned, again and again, to get onto the main local road. I gunned it to that road as I knew there would be some traffic there. And I was right. I let a sigh of partial relief, as there were other cars around now, but none were between my car and his. I somehow managed to maintain space between us, but I'm not positive that it wasn't without him allowing it. As I was now very close to the town and on a road with multiple cars around, I turned off the local highway to use a small out-of-the-way back road. That way I came into town right by the hospital. There weren't very many cars out anyways. And he still followed me. I continued along this route with all its senseless turns and backtracks, and he was still following me. The creepiest part was that he always maintained pace. If I floored, he also floored. If I slowed down, he too slowed down. Not once did he honk at me. His windows and windshield were tinted, so I couldn't see the face. I tried to keep an eye out for patrolling cops, but somehow I could not spot a single one that time. I finally lost him on the real main road when I blew through a yellow light and sped beyond any reasonably defensible amount of speed, with 911 dialed in my phone and ready to go. The road ahead was clear, and now I had a head start of a good minute or so. I was watching the rearview mirror as soon as I zoomed past the orange light to make sure that he doesn't break the signal. And he did not. He waited, and that was my opportunity to escape. As I floored my vehicle, I was aiming to get rid of him at the earliest. And I knew that his vehicle was considerably faster than mine, and if I chose to simply keep driving, he was eventually going to catch up to me. So I kept an eye out for a good spot to hide my car. There were trees around both sides of the road. And if I chose to go off the road, then my wheels would leave traces on them. I was in a fix. There were hardly any alternate routes to choose from, and far too less traffic on the road. I dialed 911, and the dispatcher asked me for my location. That's when it struck me. I did not know where I was. The dispatcher tried to calm me down as she sensed I was panicking. She asked me to open Google Maps and search for the nearest police department. The network was good, and so I could see that one was hardly a few miles away. It showed that I would take somewhat 7 minutes to get there. Before speeding off, I checked the rearview mirror, and to my horror, I saw the car in distance. I informed the officer, and she asked me to keep on updating. While I gunned it to the station, she made sure that one patrol officer was headed in my direction. I gave her the description of my car, and then his car, as I could literally see it in my rear view. It was as if I was in a thriller movie's chase sequence. Finally, just as the car almost caught up to me, I heard sirens and saw lights on top of a cop car. I was safe. The other car that was chasing me overtook me and zoomed past the patrol car. He did not go after him, but just informed on the radio that he was headed towards the department. The officer assured me that someone would catch hold of him. Then he guided me home, and I reached safely. Henceforth, I was ultra cautious before going exploring such obscure places. I don't know as to what happened to it later. I did not bother to even ask, since I was literally traumatized by the incident. Had I not gotten to the cops in time, I might not have been alive to narrate this story to you all. Now let's hop on to the second story, which I'm sure you'd enjoy the most. Now let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. Now, as you know, I always loved exploring. And although I had a tough time coming out of that horrifying encounter, I eventually got back to my regular life. But I used to inform my friends and then go out. This one time, I was out exploring an unknown place, and I was in yet another impressively extra-rural area. Although by the time this happened, Google Maps were very popular and were being used quite extensively. So I was quite aware of how the route might turn out to be and what to expect from it. The country road over there followed the creek and then suddenly turned away from it and came up out of the valley. Then after that, there was a series of 90-degree turns navigating through fields, whose owners saw to it that the local roads wouldn't be a perfect grid pattern. It was literally so haphazard that it made me extra confused. But the scene was beautiful, and the landscape was straight out of Lord of the Rings. I had left in the afternoon, maybe the late afternoon. And by the time I had explored the place quite enough, it was fast approaching dusk on a long summer day. The windows were down, and I was playing my iPod on the radio with one of those FM transceivers that you punch in an empty radio station's frequency, and it would broadcast your iPod onto it. The next 90-degree job came up, and I found that it could go on straight if I chose it. There was no mailbox, and there was in fact even a road sign. So it was for sure a public road. There was no bridge out sign, no road closed sign, or nothing else of that sort. The road, if you went straight, wasn't paved. It was barely gravel. It was a 2-track road, with grass in the middle of it. I'm in a large Dodge Ram with a small suspension lift. I had to take a call, and I chose that I'd go ahead. I started to drive down the road, and after a small stretch with really tall corn on either side, I came to some woods. The woods were very thick, and my radio suddenly went to static. It was just reaching dusk, and there was an orange sky in my mirrors, but now it was very, very dark in these woods. And in fact, the woods got thick right from the beginning. As in, the tree line did not have a typical transition that you or I would expect. No trees and then suddenly thick woods. The road too was evolving quite rapidly. It's turning into more of a walking trail than a road to drive on. Now where a modern road would have concrete sides and guardrails over small brooks, here the gravel just used bigger rocks. It was getting more and more difficult to navigate my car over this road, and I hit a really big bump. This caused my radio to suddenly come in as clear as day. The radio guy spoke.
Do you want to die a virgin?
I laughed it off, noticeably shaken upon hearing the sudden voice on the radio. I murmured something unfriendly as a joke. It goes back to static immediately. Into my right-hand side, a meadow opened up through the trees. My worries were immediately gone, and I tore off down a small decline into the meadow, exploring in 4x4. It was getting darker with each passing minute, so I headed back to the road, which seemed more like a trail, and I turned to continue the way I was going originally. The radio was coming in and out with unintelligible talking. I reasoned to myself that it was one of those audiobook channels. I came up to a dead end, and there was no way to turn my car around. Now I had never been here before, but I could see that the trail or road used to have a bridge there, but it was long gone, and before me was air and water. I was trying to figure out if I want to try to turn around or what to do, and I noticed 5 people, 2 across the way where the road began again, and 1 on the bank opposite me, and 2 downstream on the bank I'm on. They were all staring at me, visibly confused upon seeing a car at that location. Assuming I've interrupted some fishing time, I backed out down the road towards the current roads, until I found a clearing wide enough to turn around. I decided to go through the meadow once more, not creeped out at all. Honestly, I should have been. After some time in the meadow, I noticed a spot in the tree line where I could go down to some very wet dirt and go for it. I get down there and horse around a bit. The radio comes on again and says,
Have you made your decision?
Okay, now I was a bit creeped out, and I decided to keep my cool but exit the area at the earliest. What creeped me out the most was that the radio was now silent, not static. I made my way to go up the incline back into the meadow, but couldn't quite do it with the slippery mud. The radio came back on, and this time the voice said,
Time's up.
Then there was a static pause for a few seconds, followed by the same voice at the end.
We're coming.
Okay, I engaged in my fully freaked out mode. I turned off the radio and gunned for the exit. I made it up the incline into the meadow and noticed that all 5 guys were now in the tree line of the meadow, glaring at me. I noped the hell out of there at full speed and went flying down the trail or road back to the real road, just in time to see the sun setting down. It had gotten dark by the time I was out of that place. This entire incident was so creepy. The drive home was silent and mentally exhausting. I mean, if you think about it, it was either a very creepy incident or a massive coincidence. Who was the guy on the radio? How did I tune into his station? And how did he know my location at all points in time? Especially if the guys were at the bottom, in the water, they would simply not be able to see my car make its way through the entire route. And if there was someone else who saw me and kept talking, he would have to keep on following me throughout the journey. And if that had happened, then I would have surely spotted him. Also, how did he know that the guys I spotted in the water were coming back up? Also, I remember checking in the rear view. They never chased behind my car. They just kept looking and staring at the car. In fact, it felt like they were staring right through the windshield and straight into my soul. Was it some supernatural encounter? Maybe. I never cared to go there again. And to this moment, I have never returned there. And neither would I ever intend to. I did share this incident with my friends and family. Everyone had the same reaction as yours, where they had multiple theories, with none of them making sense. Although one friend, who was aware of the place, shared an interesting factoid. The place earlier had residents, but eventually got abandoned because of unknown reasons. Some claim that there were some old Red Indian tribes that used to reside there. And creepy shit kept on happening until the people decided to move out of that place. That also explained why the bridge was never repaired. I'll leave it up to you. Comment and let me know your theory or explanation for this incident. It was just so mentally exhausting that I still have no answers that make sense. I'd like to know your explanation for this creepy encounter. I remember that one night my wife and I couldn't get our 2-year-old and 1-year-old to go to sleep. They were driving the both of us a little crazy with their constant crying, and the worst part is that none of our usual strategies were working, and it was making us aggressive at each other. I suggested an evening drive to calm everyone down, and my wife was more than relieved at the idea. We quickly packed up the kids and headed out. The idea was to take a typically quiet county highway for a few miles to the interstate, drive about 10 to 12 miles west, then turn around and come home. The stretch of this county highway is particularly lacking in street lights, especially considering that it's located in the busy suburbs of New York City. We had just left the local road leading to the county highway and gotten up to speed, which was about 50 miles per hour, when I spotted something in the road ahead. This stretch of the highway was frequently crossed by deers and other animals, and it's not uncommon for freshly struck carcasses to be littered with them. By the time I alerted my wife that there was something in the road, we were passing it, and it definitely wasn't a deer. We were traveling in the middle lane, on a dark highway, doing 50 miles per hour, and a person was crossing the fast lane into the path of our car. I don't think my wife and I would have been so chilled by someone crossing this section of the road, had it not been for the rest of the circumstances. Firstly, as mentioned previously too, we were already a little rattled at each other with the kids not complying with their usual bedtime routine. Next, while my wife was glad to get out of the house on this particular night, such so-called nap rides had become a thing of the past ever since our second child was born. Not only was it twice the work to pack and unpack the kids in and out of the car, but we also had twice the precious cargo to keep safe. It just didn't seem worth the trouble and risk most of the times. Although this was an exception. Perhaps the thing that shook us both the deepest out on that dark section of highway was that there were absolutely no cars in front or behind us. This person didn't have to cross at that time. They could have crossed with zero risk either 15 seconds earlier or later of us passing by. Finally, I thought the person was holding a big stick or bat. My wife didn't see this, but she also was not the first to spot the person. This stick was what tipped the scale and triggered us to call 911. The 911 operator didn't initially think the call deserved a police response. No one had been hurt, and she said people crossed the highway there on foot all the time. It wasn't until I mentioned that I thought the person had a stick that the operator said she was dispatching someone to check it out. We hung up, relieved that perhaps we'd helped prevent someone who was either crazy or intoxicated, not hurt someone else or themselves. What we didn't know this whole time was that our 3-year-old was aware of everything that was happening. He'd not fallen asleep yet and heard us call 911 and specifically mentioned that a person was in the road. I suspect that he detected we were alarmed, and when we told him it was a deer in the road that we called the police about, he said,
"But I heard you say a person, not a deer."
We felt bad for lying to him, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do was to persist that it had been a deer and encourage him to go to sleep. We continued on towards the interstate, quietly talking about the circumstances that led us to call the cops, convincing each other that it was the right thing to do. Both kids were sound asleep by the time we made it to the juncture where I'd planned to turn around. I don't usually take the same way back home from places, mostly just for a change of scenery, and this is what I had planned to do on this night. As we took the eastbound service road towards the alternate route home, traffic came to a stop because of a car accident ahead. There was still an opportunity to take the same interstate back, so I took it, somewhat relieved that we could pass the same spot where the person was in the road, maybe getting closure that nothing bad had happened. We were only on that same dark county highway heading towards home for a few minutes when I saw the flashing lights against the trees lining the highway. They were still mostly hidden around a big bend in the road ahead. I slowed down, my heart sinking with my wife's, the both of us already knowing what had happened. We were the first car to be stopped on the highway. From where we were stopped, we could see a car crashed near the trees lining on the side. Its glass was shattered from the front, and there were no people visible. But the bat that the man had held before was lying on the road a few yards ahead. As the cop whose car was closest to the body approached our car, I heard stirring in the back seat. Oh no, I thought. Thankfully, just as our 3-year popped his head up and asked what was going, an ambulance pulled behind the cop and blocked the view of the body from our child. Before the cop could say anything, we told him what we'd seen right at this spot only 15 minutes before, while heading in the opposite direction. We told him we were the ones who had called the cops while out on our nap ride, and he told us to stay where we were so he could get our info. He returned and told us about the entire incident. Just a few minutes after we drove past the guy on the highway, there was another car. The driver was alone in the car, and he stopped upon watching him standing right in the middle of the road. The moment he slowed down, this dude charged towards him with the bat and struck the windshield. The driver floored his vehicle and bumped him while attempting to escape, subsequently hitting him hard. The crazy guy injured himself quite badly and fell on the side. 3 hours later, we made that turn on the closed highway, exited the entrance, and went home. In the days that followed, both my wife and I were sad and reflective about the situation. Having to rehash everything to an investigator a week later, we got a closure. The man was supposedly a psycho killer on the loose. There was a charge sheet on him, and the local police were already on a lookout. He was notorious for stopping unwary drivers asking for help and then killing them for fun. The police could get there on time to help the injured driver and catch hold of the psycho killer too.